I'm Paul McGuire. Welcome to Apocalypse and the End Times. And on today's program, we're going to deal with the end times in relationship to money, economics, and finances. And my special guest is Jerry Robinson, an economist, a trader, a financial author, a financial expert. He has a ministry in finances. And I probably could go on for another 30 minutes. I had the privilege of joining Jerry recently in an economic panel discussion. He's brilliant, and thank you very much, Jerry, for joining me.
Honored to be here. Thank you, Paul.
Jerry, everybody is asking about the economic system, whether they live in Europe, they're concerned about the euro. In the U.S., we're concerned about the dollar. I would assume that in Russia, they're concerned about maybe not their old currency, but the new one they would like to compete with U.S. currencies and the BRICS nations. So the economic arena is chaotic, and people are scared, and it relates to Bible prophecy. Just briefly, give us an overview from your perspective of both the U.S. and the global economic situation that we're facing right now.
Well, they are distinct, but I think that there's a lot that they have in common. And primarily, we really have to talk about currency.
Okay.
Currencies really are how we're all linked together. And the dollar is, of course, the de facto global currency. All other currencies are connected in some way to the dollar. Mm-hmm. And that really began many years ago back in Bretton Woods, back in 1944. Yeah. That really broke down in 1971 whenever the dollar closed, or whenever President Richard Nixon closed the gold window.
And explain that to us.
Oh, sure. Yeah, back in August of 1971, the government was having a very hard time financing all of its excessive spending here in Washington. So, they were having the Vietnam War, they had a lot of this big war on poverty, and so Washington was trying to deal with all of these financial issues that they had. And they soon realized that redeeming dollars in gold was no longer feasible. And many countries around the world had been very dependent upon this system, which was created in 1944. It was a dollars for gold system.
Right.
So all currencies around the world could always rely upon the fact that they could take their dollars and convert them to gold on the international gold standard. That broke down in 1971. And when it did, it caused, for the very first time in world history, for every single currency on the face of the planet, with one exception for the Swiss franc and just a very minor exception, to become fiat. And fiat simply means by decree. We would say that a king issues a decree by fiat. It means that he simply is it's an edict. And all currencies in 1971 became fiat. That is, that they simply had no backing of gold. Instead, they were merely backed by the full faith and credit of their respective governments. This, of course, was devastating to the global economic system, because now, for the first time in history, there was nothing really backing up the paper that everyone was trading, known as currency. And so we really have to take a look at currencies when we're trying to figure out what's happening on the global economic system. So, where we stand today, in the 21st century, is that we have currencies that are not backed up by anything. And we see a move amongst consumers, amongst people who are very concerned about their economies. They're very concerned about whether they're going to be able to pay off their debts. Governments are very concerned about their government debt levels. And really, at the base of this is a flawed monetary system. There is simply no backing to these currencies, and that's what causes the shaking of the global economic system. It's something that global leaders are cognizant that they have to deal with. We're likely going to see in the future some sort of Bretton Woods II, so to speak, and I'm mentioning Bretton Woods from 1944. This is where the dollar was first backed by gold. That broke down in 1971. And there is this kind of move towards moving back to some sort of gold-backed currency, or something that has backing to create more stability. So we're really faced with a growing instability in the global economic economy, and it's really rooted in the fact that we have paper currencies with no backing.
So what I hear you saying is that whether it's the euro or whatever currency, Chinese currency or Russian currency or India, the BRICS nations or whatever, there is a pervasive lack of confidence in ordinary working people across the planet regarding their currency, because their currency is just a piece of paper. Mm-hmm. And it could go down in value. It may not be redeemable. They may shut the banks down. I was in Paris, France, right around the time of the terrorist attack with the whole Charlie Hebdo thing. And while I was there, Greece had their election where they elected this leftist government, which refused to pay back the European Union the debts. And you know all about the inside information on that. And it swept all across Europe and all across Paris. And I was struck by the fact that the people in Europe were far more aware of what you just talked about, the possibility that the euro could crash, the interdependence of nations. And as you said the other day when we were doing this panel discussion, this relationship economically between the United States and Europe and the United States and Great Britain, this transatlantic union. Explain to our viewers what the transatlantic union is and how it affects both Europeans and Americans.
Sure, yeah, it's known as TTIP, is how it goes in the news. So this transatlantic union, it's in essence a free trade deal that seeks to integrate the United States and the European Union. It sounds good on paper, but unfortunately there's not a lot being written on paper about it. In fact, we've only had a few leaks through a few renegades who have released some of the documents into the public. But it's very secretive. It's a very secretive agreement that seeks to lower trade barriers between the countries of Europe and the United States. Unfortunately, as we've seen in the past, free trade deals are usually a joke. They usually enrich corporations, they usually hurt employees, they hurt consumers, and it's very insidious what we've already seen released from this transatlantic union. Evidence that even sovereignties of these nations in Europe, of course, which have already lost much of their sovereignty because of the European Union, losing more because of this transatlantic union, and of course the United States, which has been constantly battling this erosion of its sovereignty. Now with this new TTIP, we're seeing something very similar. And it's not just between the United States and Europe that we're seeing this. We're also seeing it between the United States and the Far East. There is a Trans-Pacific Partnership, a TPP, as it's called. And this is the same thing. It includes most of the Far East nations except for China. It excludes China, probably intentionally. And the U.S., of course, has been in denial about China. This is one of the most concerning things. You know, China is growing aggressively, and we constantly hear in the Western media, whether you're in Europe, whether you're in the United States, you hear constantly about how China is going to have this hard landing, or they're in a very tough environment and they certainly can't continue to grow. Well, all the data suggests that that's not true. Currently, every 8 years, the equivalent of the entire country of Japan, the population of Japan, is moving and migrating from the countryside in China into the major cities of China. China's,
excuse me,
yeah.
Which I assume means a sign of economic prosperity and growth?
That's what happens when a nation is developing. The people in the country begin to move to the cities, and of course that leads to more industrialization and more development. And that's what we're seeing in China. China is in this massive growth phase. And unfortunately in the West, we tend to dismiss that, A, because we're simply in denial of our decline, you know, here in America. The West is also concerned about the rise of China because all throughout history, those who know history know that China has long been one of the major empires throughout history. Even going back to the British Empire, this may be stunning, but it's just data. Back during the height of the British Empire, whenever they said the sun never set on the British Empire, going back to the mid-1800s, at the height of the British Empire, China and the Chinese Empire had a larger economic output figure, that what they call GDP, larger than the British Empire in its entirety. So
China At a larger
GDP output.
That is mind-blowing. I've never heard that before.
Than the entire British Empire, at the height of the British Empire. So China is no stranger to empire. And they have fallen, obviously. Communism was part of their fall. But they are rising now, and the West has very much underestimated China, I believe. I believe over the course of the next several decades, we're going to see a very different world that emerges, led by China. And back to Europe for a minute, in the transatlantic union. You know, many people are concerned that the European Union is going to implode or it's going to disappear.
Right.
There's no doubt that it's a bad idea. I mean, when you try to take all of these cultures, these languages, these people with these histories, they have different unemployment rates, they have different economic issues, and you force them together, it's a very difficult thing to manage. Of course, what we believe from a prophetic viewpoint is that this is how you begin a global currency. You simply have to learn how to bring countries together first and figure out how to manage it. So the European Union, which has been, decades in the making, as you pointed out recently, Jean-Claude Monet was one of the architects. And of course, but it goes back even further. Napoleon was trying to do this back in, in the 1800s, of course, and you go back and of course Hitler, in the Third Reich. This has been this dream to unite Europe. And what we see in Europe now is they have finally achieved it. Now, there's no doubt there's a lot to complain about, but we believe that this is the template that the globalists want to use to create an international order. And if they cannot get Europe right, then how in the world are they going to get the global currency right? So they're trying to work out the kinks with Europe now, and there's no doubt there's going to be hiccups along the way. But people shouldn't underestimate Europe either, because they have so much invested in this European experiment. And I believe that it's the template for other coming regional currencies similar to the euro. We may see something in the Asian Union. We may see something in the African Union, a new currency. Middle East is already talking. They've been postponing this for a long time, but the Gulf region has been trying to come out with a gold-backed dinar that would actually be a currency that covers the entire Middle East. So we're seeing this move, and it's something that we should all be paying attention to.
Jerry, I'm glad you brought this out, because as students of Bible prophecy know, and you know, of course, in Daniel chapter 9, we read about the vision that the prophet Daniel interpreted from the king of Babylon, and it was a giant statue representing 4 world empires, and interestingly enough, from gold down to the toes, which were a mixture of metal and ceramic clay. And that the 10 toes is a depiction of the revived Roman Empire, which many believe is built around the European Union, or it could possibly be these 10 regions or 10 regional global governments, which you outlined, such as the template, the European Union, the North American Union, the Asian Union, African Union, so on and so forth, 10 regional global governments. So if you're correct in your analysis of the globalist game plan, potentially the revived Roman Empire could transcend just the European Union. It could be the 10 regional global governments. And I'm not saying that as a definitive fact, it's just a speculation. But you also said something that was very interesting, and that is that the role of currency, which most people don't understand, the role of currency in secretly bringing about these governmental power structures. Explain to our listeners, both in America and Europe, take the masquerade away from what is currency really?
Well, currency is not money, certainly if it's not backed up by something. You know, money is something that is a store of value. It's something that is a medium of exchange, but it's also the numeraire in accounting, and it's something that you can actually tangibly feel and touch. Throughout history, we've used shells. We've used, they've used cattle even in sometimes you can go back throughout history and see different things that were used as money. Well, gold and silver were the preferred methods. because they were so portable. And of course, as we became more bright, I guess, we began to realize that we could do receipt money. Well, we can simply take the gold, take it down to the goldsmith, and he would give us a piece of paper. And then we could always go back to the goldsmith and get our gold. Well, then suddenly the government stepped in and said, let's regulate this. And eventually by 1971, they took away the gold and they left you with a piece of paper. It's a receipt. Well, it's no longer a receipt now. In fact, if you take a look at a dollar bill, for example, using the U.S. dollar, it says at the very top, Federal Reserve note. Note, of course, when you think about that, if I said you have a car note, you would say that means I have a car loan. And so when we look at a Federal Reserve note, we're staring at a Federal Reserve loan. That is, all of these dollars that are in existence are mere loans that have been made by the Federal Reserve to the United States government. The government then disperses those throughout the economy, and then, of course, we have to pay those back to the Federal Reserve with interest, which is set by the Federal Reserve. So it's a really big scam. Central banks are the ones who have the greatest incentive to see war. They're the ones who have the greatest incentive to see governments borrow for other reasons. And so the central banks have a very distorted incentive, and they lead us, in many times, in the wrong direction consistently. I'll give you an example of what happened after 1971. When the gold window was closed and gold was no longer exchanged for dollars on the international standard, President Nixon and Henry Kissinger he was currently the Secretary of State. President Nixon was running the White House here in America. And they realized that the demand for U.S. dollars was going down around the globe because it was not backed by gold. And people began to say, why should we hold these dollars if we can hold something else? It doesn't matter now. Well, knowing this, Kissinger was able to broker a deal with the Saudi Arabian government. And Saudi Arabia, about that time, we were discovering, had a lot of oil, and they had much more oil than we had ever realized. In exchange for them pricing all of their oil in U.S. dollars, we would then protect them. That's, of course, why we put military bases there in Gulf War I. That's why we're such strong allies with the Saudis, despite the fact that they hate Christians, and despite the fact that they hate Israel, and despite the fact that they want nuclear weapons, and despite the fact that Saudi Arabia is funding ISIS and things of this nature. Despite all of that, we have been buddies with them because they price their oil in dollars. Now, what does this do? Why is that important? Well, it's important because it creates a demand for dollars. Now people in Japan who want to buy oil from Saudi Arabia now have to convert their yen into dollars to buy oil from Saudi Arabia. Well, this creates a demand. Now, why would the U.S. want a demand for its currency? Well, because they want to create a supply. And that's how they get themselves out of economic jams. What did the Federal Reserve do in 2007, 2008 when the market crashed? They printed money. Now, if they didn't have a global demand for the dollar, it would have created massive inflation. Because when you inject a tremendous amount of currency into the economy of any economy, it causes all the general price levels to go up. But if you have a global demand around the world for that currency, then you can hide or mask those dollars because people have to hold them, and so you don't have this massive inflation. Well, Saudi Arabia has been very good to America in that respect, and by 1975, all of the OPEC nations were taking dollars. Well, fast forward to where we are now, and we're now beginning to see a reversal of this. Iraq was one of the first back in September of 2000 to say, we no longer want to take dollars for our oil, we want euros. What many people don't know is that one of the very first acts of the U.S. military when they went into Iraq and invaded back in 2003 was to convert from the petro-euro system back to the dollar system. Now all of the oil in Iraq is priced back in dollars, now that Saddam Hussein is gone. Iran does not want to use dollars for its oil. It's part of our axis of evil here in America. North Korea doesn't want to pay for oil in dollars. We don't like North Korea here in America. Venezuela doesn't want to use dollars or accept dollars for its oil. That's another reason why we don't like Venezuela. Russia and China are moving away from using the U.S. dollar for oil. So this petrodollar system, this oil for dollar system that replaced the dollars for gold system, is breaking down now. So we're kind of in another 1971 scenario where the faith around the world is waning in the U.S. dollar, and this means that the Federal Reserve now is losing its permission slip to print more money because who's going to hold it?
Does this mean, and we're going to get into this deeper in a moment, but let's let our viewers think about it for a moment, and I want to probe this more, but it appears to be that an economic crisis is on the horizon, that at some point there will be a tipping point, especially as you have the BRICS nations and Russia and China competing to put forth some kind of new world currency. And we're going to dig into that deeper, what that will mean to people in America and Europe and around the world if there's a tipping point and we do go into a different world currency. My guest is Jerry Robinson, financial expert, a man who understands the Bible, but a man who also understands economics and, most importantly, the real meaning of currency. I'm Paul McGuire. You're watching Apocalypse and the End Times.